Before you read on, know this. A heart can be a quiet room, locked from the inside. This is not a story of how that door was broken down, but how the key was gently offered, and how two people, divided by a world of silence and suspicion, learned that the most profound trust is built not in grand gestures, but in the spaces between breaths, in the warmth of a shared fire, and in the slow, careful meeting of hands in the dark. Josiah Kent lived by the sun. It woke him in the pale pre-dawn, guided his hands as he mended fence lines and tended his small herd, and its setting marked the end of his labor. He would then retreat into his cabin, a small, sturdy structure he had built with his own hands at the edge of the territory. Inside, the silence was absolute. He would eat his meal at a table set for one, the chair across from him perpetually, achingly empty. He washed his single plate, his single cup, and banked the fire for the night. His life was an exercise in orderly solitude, a fortress built to keep the ghosts of the war at bay. He had come west to escape the sound of men's shouting and the smell of gunpowder, seeking a quiet atonement in the rhythm of the land. But the land was a lonely confessor, and the silence in his cabin often felt less like peace and more like a punishment. He was a competent man, a stoic man, and a man who was slowly being hollowed out by the quiet. He found her by the creek that marked the western edge of his property. She was collapsed against the trunk of a cottonwood, her dark hair a stark contrast against the pale bark. She was Apache, that much was clear from her buckskin dress and the intricate beadwork on her moccasins. One of her legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a dark, feverish flush stained her high cheekbones. He saw the faint rise and fall of her chest and knew she was alive. His every instinct, honed by years on the frontier and in the cavalry, screamed caution. His people and hers were locked in a bitter, bloody struggle. To bring her into his home was to invite a world of trouble. He could leave her, ride for the fort, let the authorities handle it. It would be the safe, sensible thing to do. He looked down at her face, etched with pain even in her delirium, and saw not an enemy, but a woman in need of help. The moral code that he lived by, the one that felt like the only clean thing left in him, would not let him turn away. He knelt, his movements slow, deliberate. "Ma'am," he said softly, not wanting to startle her, "I'm not going to hurt you." Her eyes fluttered open, dark and clouded with fever, but sharp with a defiant, untamed spirit. She tried to push herself away, her hand instinctively going to a knife that was no longer at her belt. "Easy now," he said, keeping his hands open, visible. "Your leg is broken. You need shelter." He was a man of few words, and he offered them now as a simple statement of fact. Her gaze swept over him, taking in the worn denim of his trousers, the solid set of his shoulders, the quiet intensity in his gray eyes. He saw the flicker of calculation in her expression, the weighing of one danger against another. Finally, with a barely perceptible nod, she relented, slumping back against the tree. He lifted her as gently as he could, surprised by how little she weighed. As he carried her back toward the solitary light of his cabin, he felt the first crack appear in the walls of his well-ordered solitude. He was bringing the world, with all its complications and dangers, across his threshold. The quiet was about to be broken. Her name was Nalin. She told him this on the third day, her voice a low, raspy whisper. The fever had broken, leaving her weak but lucid, her dark eyes clear and startlingly perceptive. She watched his every move from the cot he had set up for her by the hearth, the warmest spot in the cabin. He had set her leg as best he could, splinting it with straight branches and strips of clean linen. He had brewed willow bark tea for the fever, a remedy he'd learned from a scout long ago. He moved about the cabin with a quiet efficiency, never crowding her, always leaving a cup of water or a bowl of thin broth within her reach, before retreating to his own side of the room. He spoke little, his actions his only language. "You are safe here." I mean you no harm. For Nalin, the cabin was a cage, albeit a gentle one. She was a woman of the open spaces, of the wind and the sun. The four walls pressed in on her, the silence of this solitary man, a heavy blanket. She was a survivor. She had survived the loss of her family, the destruction of her village, the long, desperate flight that had ended with a fall in a rocky creek bed. She would survive this. But survival, for Nalin, required agency. She would not be a helpless invalid, a burden. I will work, she stated, her voice gaining strength. She pushed herself up on her elbows, her gaze unwavering. I will not take charity from a white man. Josiah stopped his work, turning from the harness he was mending. He looked at her, at the fierce pride that burned in her eyes, and understood. He gave a single, accepting nod. All right. Thus began their strange domestic arrangement. From her cot, she took over his mending, her stitches small and neat, far superior to his own clumsy efforts. She showed him how to properly grind the corn he had, releasing a finer, sweeter flour. Her hands, though weakened by her ordeal, were never idle. She would braid strips of leather. He gave her into strong, supple ropes, her fingers moving with a practiced, hypnotic rhythm. He, in turn, became her legs. He would bring her whatever she requested from the outside world-specific herbs from the creek bed, stones of a certain smoothness for grinding, fresh water from the spring. He learned to see the landscape through her eyes, to notice the subtle things he had always overlooked. The world outside his door, once just a backdrop to his lonely routine, began to take on new textures, new meanings. One evening, he was cleaning his rifle, the familiar scent of gun oil filling the small space. It was a routine born of military habit, a nightly ritual of readiness. He finished his work and looked up to see her watching him, her expression unreadable. The rifle was a symbol of the conflict that defined their peoples, a tool of violence that had taken so much from her. He thought for a moment, then he did something he had never done for anyone. He opened the action, showing her the empty chamber. Then he stood, walked over to the wall, and hung the rifle on its pegs. He left the ammunition box on the far side of the room. It was a silent, unilateral disarmament. It was a vow. The violence of the world will not enter this home. A flicker of something surprise, gratitude, a nascent trust warmed her dark eyes. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. In the quiet cabin, surrounded by a world that called them enemies, they had just signed their first treaty. Nalin healed slowly, the sharp edges of her pain dulling into a persistent ache. With a crutch Josiah had fashioned for her from a sturdy branch of oak, she began to move around the cabin. Her presence changed the very air of the small space. Where once there had been only the stark functionality of a bachelor's existence, small touches of her life began to appear. The scent of the herbs she kept to dress her wound, a clean, earthy smell, mingled with the wood smoke. A small, intricate pattern she had woven from colored threads now hung from a nail on the wall. The cabin began to feel less like a shelter and more like a home. Josiah found himself watching the way the firelight caught the silver in the single streak of hair at her temple, the focused intensity of her expression as she worked. A strange, unfamiliar yearning began to stir in him, a longing for something more than just a shared roof. He began to leave wildflowers he found on his rides, a stem of Indian paintbrush, a sprig of purple sage on the table for her. He never acknowledged the gesture, and she never mentioned it, but the flowers always ended up in a cup of water by her cot. One cool evening, she was struggling to thread a needle in the dim light, her brow furrowed in frustration. Without a word, Josiah rose, lit a second lantern, and placed it on the table beside her, adjusting the wick until the light was just right. "Thank you," she murmured, not looking up. He stood there for a moment, watching her sure hands resume their work. He saw her shiver, a slight tremor from the evening chill. His bedroll lay by the door, where he'd taken to sleeping to give her more space. He retrieved the thick wool blanket, unfolded it, and gently draped it over her shoulders. His fingers brushed against the nape of her neck, a fleeting touch of calloused skin against soft, warm flesh. The contact was electric. She went still, her needle poised in mid-air. He froze, his hand hovering near her shoulder, realizing he had crossed an invisible line. He had touched her without asking. "Sorry," he said, his voice a low rasp. He started to pull his hand back. Her own hand came up and rested lightly on his, stopping its retreat. The touch was feather-light. It had held the weight of a profound decision. "Josiah," she said, speaking his name for the first time. The sound of it in her voice, soft and quiet, was more intimate than the touch itself. She turned her head, her dark eyes meeting his. In their depths, he saw not fear or anger, but a mirror of his own quiet longing. She held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes, this is allowed." He let his hand rest on her shoulder for a heartbeat longer, before letting it fall away, his entire being thrumming with the silent communication that had just passed between them. He retreated to his side of the room, his heart pounding a rhythm that was no longer lonely, but filled with a fragile, terrifying hope. As Nalin's legs strengthened, the unspoken question of her departure hung in the air between them. The arrangement had been for her recovery. Soon, there would be no reason for her to stay. The thought left a hollow ache in Josiah's chest. The silence he had once cultivated now seemed like a barren wasteland, and the idea of returning to it was unbearable. He could not, would not, ask her to stay. Her freedom, her agency, was paramount. He knew what it was to be trapped, and he would never be a cage for her. The choice had to be hers. Nalin felt the changing of the seasons in her bones. Autumn was painting the hills in shades of rust and gold. Soon the cold would come, and with it, the difficulty of travel. She could leave. She was strong enough now to make her way to one of the free Apache bands that still lived in the high country. But the thought of leaving the quiet strength of the cabin, of the man within it, felt like trading a safe harbor for a storm. She had watched him, studied him. She had seen the way he treated his horse with a gentle hand, the way he left food out for a stray dog that lived in the hills, the profound respect he showed her in every small gesture. He was a man of peace, a man who had built a life in direct opposition to the violence of his past. He was nothing like the other white men she had known. He was good. The decision came to a head one night when the first hard frost of the season coated the window panes with a delicate, icy lace. A fire in the hearth fought against a cold that seemed to seep through the very walls of the cabin. Josiah had given her his bed when she first arrived, taking the colder spot on the floor for himself. Tonight, the cold was a palpable thing. He saw her draw her thin blanket tighter, saw the shiver she tried to suppress. He rose and added another log to the fire, the flames leaping up, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He stood with his back to her, wrestling with his own code. To offer what he was thinking felt like a transgression, a step too far. But to let her be cold felt like a failure of his duty to care for her. He turned, his face serious in the firelight. "Nalin," he began, his voice quiet. "It's too cold for the floor. The bed is large enough." He rushed on, the words tumbling out. "You could. We could share it. For warmth. I would keep to my own side. I would not touch you." He had laid the offer at her feet, vulnerable, giving her all the power. He held his breath, waiting for her answer. Nalin looked from the cold, hard floor to the relative warmth and comfort of the bed. She looked at Josiah, at the earnest, honorable plea in his eyes. He was not asking for intimacy. He was offering comfort, partnership against the cold. She thought of the long, cold night ahead. She thought of the longer, colder future that awaited her if she left. She made her choice. "There is only one blanket," she said, her voice soft but steady. It was not a refusal, but a practical observation, an acceptance of the terms, and a gentle step toward him. A profound relief washed over Josiah, so potent it almost buckled his knees. "I will keep you warm," he said. It was a simple promise, a plain vow. Later, they lay in the dark, a careful foot of space between them, the single thick blanket covering them both. The air was frigid, but under the blanket, a small pocket of shared warmth began to grow. Josiah lay perfectly still, listening to the sound of her breathing, a quiet rhythm that was both a comfort and a sweet, yearning torture. He had never felt so close to another human being, nor so utterly, respectfully alone. The first real cold snap of the season brought with it an unwelcome visitor. Captain McAllister, Josiah's former commanding officer and now a powerful local rancher, rode up to the cabin one afternoon, his 2 ranch hands staying a respectful distance behind him. McAllister was a man who saw the world in terms of possessions, and he considered the entire territory his personal property. He dismounted, his spurs jingling, his eyes taking in the small, tidy homestead with a contemptuous air. "Kent," he said, his voice a jovial boom that didn't quite mask its underlying steel. "Heard you'd gone native out here. Didn't realize it was literal." His gaze flickered to the cabin door, where Nalin had appeared, her expression a calm, unreadable mask. McAllister's eyes roamed over her, a slow, appraising look that made Josiah's hands clench into fists at his sides. "Found yourself some company. Ought to be careful. The army pays a bounty for strays like that." The threat was clear, wrapped in the casual cruelty that Josiah remembered all too well. Josiah stepped slightly forward, placing himself between McAllister and Nalin. It was a subtle, protective movement. "She's under my roof, Captain," he said, his voice low and even. "And under my protection." McAllister laughed, a short, barking sound. "Protection? Don't be a fool, Kent. You're harboring an enemy. It's my duty as a citizen to report it. Unless, of course, you'd be willing to sell her contract to me. I could use a new laundress at the ranch." He was talking about her as if she were a piece of livestock, his entitlement a suffocating presence. Nalin did not flinch. She met McAllister's gaze with a look of such cool disdain that it momentarily silenced him. Her pride was a weapon he did not know how to counter. "I am not for sale," she said, her English clear and precise. Josiah looked at her, a fierce surge of pride welling in his chest. "You heard the lady," he said to McAllister. "This is my property. You're trespassing. I suggest you leave." For a moment, the 2 men stood in silent opposition, the old hierarchy of command warring with the simple reality of the present. McAllister was used to giving orders and having them obeyed. Josiah was no longer a soldier taking them. Finally, with a sneer, McAllister turned back to his horse. "You're making a mistake, Kent," he spat, "a big one." He mounted, his movements stiff with anger. "When the winter breaks, I'll be back, with the law on my side." He rode off, his men trailing behind him, leaving a tense, charged silence in their wake. That night, the confrontation hung in the air between them. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a name and a face. They sat by the fire, the space between them filled with a new, somber intimacy. "He is a man who breaks things," Nalin said softly, staring into the flames. "Yes," Josiah agreed. He looked at his hands, at the calluses and scars from a lifetime of work and war. "I was like him once," he confessed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "In the war, I followed orders. I saw, I was part of the breaking." He told her then of the battle that had shattered his soul, of the village that had been destroyed, of the reason he had left that life behind to seek a quiet place to heal. When he was finished, the silence returned, heavier now with the weight of his confession. Nalin reached out, her fingers gently touching the back of his hand. She did not offer words of comfort or absolution, she offered something more profound. "My village, too," she whispered, her own story of loss a quiet, heartbreaking echo of his. In the warm glow of the firelight, two enemies, two survivors, found a common ground in their shared history of pain. The walls between them, already so thin, finally dissolved completely. The threat of McAllister's return lingered over the homestead like a winter shadow. But instead of driving them apart, it solidified their bond, transforming their quiet cohabitation into a true partnership. They began to prepare for the long winter, and for the confrontation they knew would come with the spring thaw. Their days took on a new rhythm, one of shared purpose. They worked together, moving with an unspoken understanding. He would chop wood, his axe rising and falling in a steady, powerful arc, and she would stack it, creating a neat, solid wall against the cabin that would keep out the winter winds. Her leg was strong now, the limp almost gone. She moved with a natural grace that he found endlessly captivating. One afternoon, as he was repairing the latch on the stable door, she came to him holding his heavy winter coat. A seam under the arm had split open. "This will not keep out the wind," she said, her finger tracing the tear. "Give it to me." At evening, by the light of the fire, she set to work. She did not use ordinary thread, but a thin, incredibly strong strand of sinew she had prepared herself. Her needle, one he had traded for in town, moved with a deft, sure purpose. He sat across from her, sharpening his axe, pretending not to watch, but his gaze was continually drawn to the sight of her mending his coat, claiming it, making it stronger. It was a simple domestic act, yet it felt like the most profound statement of belonging he had ever witnessed. She was weaving herself into the fabric of his life, stitch by stitch. A few days later, he presented her with a gift. He had spent hours in his workshop, carefully carving a piece of seasoned hickory. It was a new handle for her skinning knife, which had been old and cracked. The new handle was smooth, perfectly balanced, and shaped to fit her hand exactly. He had sanded it until it felt like polished stone. It was a simple, practical object, but it was imbued with all the care and attention he was still unable to speak aloud. He offered it to her, holding it out on his open palm. She took it, her fingers closing around the smooth wood. She tested its weight, its balance. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, an unguarded expression of pure pleasure that made his heart ache. "It fits," she said softly. "Yes," he replied, his voice thick. "It was made for you." In that quiet exchange, in the offering of a mended coat and a carved handle, they were making their own vows, promises of care and devotion that needed no words. They were no longer a soldier and a refugee, a white man and an Apache woman. They were Josiah and Nalin, and they would face what was coming together. Winter locked the land in its cold, silent embrace. The world outside the cabin shrank, and their life together deepened, becoming a small, warm circle of light in the vast, white expanse. The shared bed was no longer a matter of practicality, but a place of quiet intimacy. The space between them had narrowed, and some nights he would wake to find her hand resting lightly on his arm, or he would shift, and the soft fabric of her sleeve would brush against his skin. Each accidental touch was a small, searing flame. The yearning between them was a constant, palpable presence, a low hum beneath the surface of their daily routines. They both felt it, and they both honored the silent, unspoken boundary between them, knowing that to cross it required a choice, not a surrender to circumstance. The choice came on a night when a fierce blizzard descended from the north, shaking the cabin with its fury. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the snow piled in deep drifts against the door. Inside, however, the fire burned bright, and the cabin was filled with the warm, savory smell of the stew Nalin had made. After they had eaten, a comfortable silence settled over them. Nalin rose and went to the small chest where she kept her few possessions. She returned with something held carefully in her hands. It was a leather pouch, intricately decorated with beads in a pattern of a soaring hawk. "My grandmother made this," she said, her voice soft. "It is a medicine pouch, for protection, for a warrior's heart." She held it out to him. "This is for you." Josiah took it, the soft leather warm from her hands. The pouch was beautiful, a piece of her heritage, of her soul, and she was offering it to him. He looked from the gift to her face, and saw in her eyes a deep, unguarded vulnerability, an open invitation. The time for unspoken truths was over. "Nalin," he said, his voice husky. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently cup her jaw, his thumb resting on the curve of her cheek. It was a question. "May I?" She did not nod this time. She leaned into his touch, a clear and undeniable answer. "Yes." He closed the small distance between them and kissed her. It was a kiss of infinite tenderness, a quiet exploration. It held all the longing of the lonely months, all the respect he felt for her fierce spirit, all the gratitude he felt for the way she had brought his world back to life. She returned the kiss with a hesitant, yielding passion, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, over the steady, thundering beat of his heart. The storm could rage outside. The threats of the world could wait. In that moment, there was only the two of them, in the warm, firelit circle of their home, finally, freely, choosing each other. The spring thaw was a slow, muddy affair, and it brought McAllister back, just as he had promised. He did not come with the marshal this time, but with 4 armed men, their faces hard and uncompromising. They rode into the yard and dismounted, forming a loose, intimidating line. McAllister's face was a mask of smug certainty. He had come to collect his property. Josiah met him on the porch, unarmed, his stance calm but unyielding. Nalin stood in the doorway just behind him, not as a woman in need of protection, but as an equal partner, her presence a silent statement of her place in this home. "McAllister," Josiah said, his voice flat, "I told you to leave this place." "I'm not here for you, Kent," McAllister sneered. "I'm here for her. Under the Territorial Reclamation Act, all non-treaty natives are considered hostile. She's coming with me to the fort." He was using the law as a bludgeon, twisting it to serve his own cruel purposes. "She is not hostile," Josiah stated, his voice ringing with conviction. "She is my wife." The words, spoken aloud for the first time, settled in the air with the weight of an oath. He had not planned to say them, but in that moment, he knew them to be the truest thing he had ever said. He felt Nalin's hand come to rest on the small of his back, a silent signal of solidarity. McAllister's face contorted in a sneer of disbelief and rage. "You'd marry a savage? You're a disgrace to your uniform, to your race." He gestured to his men. "Take her." 2 of the men started forward, their hands reaching for Nalin. It was then that Nalin moved, stepping forward to stand beside Josiah, her head held high. She looked not at the hired guns, but directly at McAllister, her gaze sharp enough to cut stone. She spoke, her voice not loud, but carrying a power that made the men hesitate. "My people call you enemy," she said, her English precise, each word a carefully chosen stone. Her gaze then shifted to Josiah, and her expression softened, a universe of love and fierce loyalty in her eyes. "But I call you mine." The declaration was absolute. It was a claiming, a vow spoken in the face of hatred and violence. It was the only weapon they needed. The hired men stopped, looking uncertainly from the defiant woman to the immovable man at her side, and then to their employer. They were paid to be thugs, not to break up a home. They saw the truth of the situation. This was not law enforcement. This was a personal vendetta, and the couple before them would not be broken. One of the men slowly shook his head and took a step back. The others followed his lead. McAllister was left alone, his authority crumbling. He looked at Josiah and Nalin, at their unbreakable, united front, and he knew he was defeated. With a final, impotent curse, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, his posse trailing behind him like a pack of chastened dogs. The departure of McAllister and his men left a profound quiet in its wake. The threat had been met and vanquished, not with violence, but with the simple, unassailable power of their bond. Josiah and Nalin stood on the porch for a long moment, the spring air fresh and clean around them. Then he turned to her, his heart so full of emotion he felt it might break. He reached out and gently took her hands in his. They were trembling slightly. The confrontation had taken its toll. He saw a long, shallow scratch on the back of her hand where she must have scraped it against the rough wood of the doorframe. Without a word, he led her inside to the wash basin. The ritual was familiar, intimate. He pumped the water, his hand covering hers, and carefully, tenderly, washed the grime and the fear away. He dried her skin with a soft cloth and examined the scratch. It was nothing, a minor injury, but he treated it with the gravity of a surgeon. He found a tin of salve she had made from comfrey and yarrow and applied it to the broken skin, his touch a silent apology for the world's harshness. When he was finished, she did not pull her hand away. Instead, she turned it over and laced her fingers through his. She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "Husband?" she asked softly, the word a question, a test, a hope. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "If you'll have me." "I have already claimed you," she reminded him gently, a small smile playing on her lips. "And I you," he replied. He drew her closer, until her head rested on his chest, right over the steady beat of his heart. He could feel the tension draining out of her, replaced by a deep, shuddering sigh of relief. He held her like that for a long time, simply breathing together, two halves of a whole. He had spent years building a fortress of solitude to protect himself from the world. She had come and shown him that the only true fortress was the one they had just built together, a sanctuary founded not on stone and wood, but on a love that was stronger than any law, any prejudice, any enemy. The aftercare was not just for the small scratch on her hand. It was for the old, deep wounds they both carried. And in that quiet, tender moment, they began to heal together. The word spread, as words do in a small community. The story of the blacksmith and his Apache wife, of how they had faced down Captain McAllister without firing a single shot, became a local legend. McAllister, his authority diminished, retreated to his ranch, his power over the town broken. For Josiah and Nalin, the world outside their homestead began to change. When they rode into town for supplies, the stares they received were no longer hostile or suspicious, but filled with a grudging, and then a genuine respect. They had stood their ground for something the townspeople understood, the sanctity of a home. Their life fell into a new rhythm, one of peace and quiet joy. It was a life built of small, precious moments. It was the site of Nalin's garden, where she grew not only vegetables for their table, but the herbs of her people, a small patch of her heritage thriving in this new soil. It was the sound of Josiah, whistling a tuneless, cheerful sound he hadn't made in years as he worked at his forge. He no longer mended only what was broken. He began to create things of beauty. He forged a set of delicate iron hooks for her to hang her drying herbs from, and a sturdy, elegant trivet to protect their table from hot pots. Each object was a love letter written in steel. One summer evening, they sat on the porch, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance in the twilight. Nalin was leaning against him, her head on his shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her. She was stitching a small leather pouch, a gift for the marshal's newborn son. "Josiah," she said, her voice a soft murmur against his shirt. "This place, our home, it needs a name." He thought for a moment. He looked out at the land hers, theirs. He looked at the sturdy cabin, the warm light spilling from the window. He thought of the long journey that had brought them both to this unlikely peace. Sanctuary, he said. We'll call it sanctuary. She looked up at him, her smile radiant in the fading light. Sanctuary, she repeated, the word sounding perfect on her tongue. It was more than a name. It was a vow, a testament to what they had built. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, unadorned gold band he had bought on his last trip to town. He took her left hand and slipped it onto her finger. It was a symbol from his world, now joined with hers. She looked at the ring, then at him, her eyes shining. She leaned in and kissed him, a slow, sweet kiss that held the promise of all the quiet, ordinary, beautiful days to come. The land was the same, but they had transformed it. Together, they had built a home. Their future unfolded with the gentle certainty of the changing seasons. The house that had once been a bastion of solitude was now filled with the low hum of a shared life. The single chair had long been joined by another, and their evenings were spent in comfortable proximity, the silence between them a language of its own. They became a quiet fixture in the landscape of promise, a testament to a love that had bridged a divide wider than any canyon. He taught her to read and write English, their lessons by the firelight a continuation of their early intimacy. She, in turn, taught him the names of the stars in her own language, sharing the stories and the wisdom of her people. They were weaving their two worlds into a single strong tapestry. One autumn, years later, a young couple, newly arrived and struggling, came to their door seeking work. Josiah, remembering his own lonely beginnings, took the husband on as an apprentice at the forge. Nalin, seeing the fear and uncertainty in the young wife's eyes, brought her inside for a warm meal. Their sanctuary, once built for two, began to expand, its walls of quiet strength and compassion making room for others. They were creating not just a home, but a family, one founded on the simple principles they had learned together: respect, kindness, and the quiet courage to stand for what is right. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Josiah and Nalin stood on their porch, watching their apprentice and his wife head back to the small bunkhouse Josiah had built for them. He reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, the familiar fit a constant, reassuring comfort. The gold band on her finger gleamed in the last light of day. On a thin leather cord around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt, he still wore the hawk feather medicine pouch she had given him. They were tokens of their two worlds, worn together. He looked at her, at the woman who had faced down his ghosts, and taught him the meaning of peace, the enemy who had become his entire world. The lines of time had softened the edges of her face, but the fierce, proud spirit in her eyes burned as brightly as ever. "I love you, Nalin Kent," he said, the words as easy and natural as breathing. She leaned into him, her head resting in its familiar place on his shoulder. "I know, Josiah," she whispered, her hand tightening on his. "I know." The future was unwritten, but they would face it as they had faced everything else, together in the quiet strength of the sanctuary they had built.